This is the Watchmen Podcast on TV Podcast Industries. Welcome, watchers. This is TV Podcast Industries, and we are here for our Watchmen Prelude episode of the HBO series Watchmen. I am John, one of your hosts.
I'm Derek, one of your other hosts.
And rounding out this trio of men watching, I am Chris.
You say potato, I say potato. Prelude or prelude is a big question that we have for this episode.
Prelude.
Okay, prelude.
Prelude.
There you go. Must be an Irish thing for two of our hosts.
Prelude.
Oh, as Chris joked about, we have gone from The Boys onto Watchmen, which is pretty good, right, for our podcasts.
Yes, that's it. From The Boys to Watching Men.
Mm-hmm.
So, wow.
Good, huh?
Let's do this.
Yeah. We did go through Pennyworth as well over on our DC podcast. So this is a really interesting one. We have a really adult show about superheroes that we did earlier this year, which was The Boys over on Amazon Prime. We've moved through Pennyworth, which was a very adult, also DC show based in the kind of Gotham Batman universe. And now we're back in probably the most well-known of the non-specific DC universe books, but published by DC, The Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. This is a pretty adult kind of show coming up, and a very adult book to begin with, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think, this will certainly be different from The Boys. I think they kind of operate within the same concept or the same space, this alternative take on superheroes. But certainly, I think the angle at which Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, came at The Watchmen, I mean, it was totally unique for the time. I think this take from Damon Lindelof, is probably going to be, very Easter eggy. We know his work on Lost, but also I think the content will be, also very adult, very serious.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a somewhat of a new direction for a lot of the coverage of what we've been doing, but also a lot of the what's expected on HBO now. Mm-hmm. In that, I get the feeling based on his previous work, he'll try and touch on some more, similar to Alan Moore was touching on the war and things like that when he was developing his book and writing his book. Damon Lindelof will very much cover some topical things that are happening here. Mm-hmm. It's definitely going to be an interesting thing. So happy to be here. But where are we? I should ask.
Yes. Why are we here? We are going to effectively do this prelude to the Watchmen series on HBO. We're not going to look into the 12-issue comic series, nor are we going to look at the movie that was done by Zack Snyder before the air shows. I think what we want to do is just generally talk about both the comic and the movie, and how that may or may not relate to this new TV series on HBO called The Watchmen. And then it would be good for us to maybe go back over the 12-issue comic and the movie after we've covered the, was it 9 or 10 episode series of The Watchmen here on HBO?
Yes, it's a 9-episode limited series on HBO, starting 21st of October. We've absolutely read the comics. I think all of us have read them, some more recently than others. We've definitely watched the movies. There's about 4 different versions of the final movie from Zack Snyder as well. I think we've all watched various versions. There's theatrical, there's the director's, and there's the ultimate cut. We'll talk about those in this podcast here as well. If you don't want to be spoiled at all about what could be coming up on the Watchmen TV show, this is the place to hop off. Come back to us next time. Subscribe to the podcast over on tvpodcastindustries.com. We'll be releasing our first review of the show on the 21st of October, our time, which is just after the show airs in the US on the 20th of October. We'll have our podcast ready to go, and then you can come back to us and hear our thoughts about the first episode and the rest of the show. So make sure you subscribe. Been really good to have you join us and just hear our voices, I suppose, to begin with, For the rest of you, we're going to talk about the comic book, we're going to talk about the movie, and we're going to talk about our thoughts about what we think is going to happen in the first season of the show as well. Some interesting stuff that's come up. So for those of you that aren't going to continue with us and are going to come back next week for our review, thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk to you then.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as well, if you are excited for The Watchmen, what are you excited about? Please send in your thoughts or comments on anything to do with The Watchmen and what you're looking forward to in this show. And if you want to do that, as well as leaving feedback during our coverage of the Watchmen series, you can head on over to our community over at Facebook on our Facebook group, which is facebook.com/groups/TV Podcast Industries, or you can send in an email to feedback@tvpodcastindustries.com.
Right.
So absolutely, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what you're excited about for the Watchmen, or what you thought about each episode or the series whilst you watch it through with our podcast.
Mm-hmm. I think it's time, guys. Let's get on to talking about the comic a bit. We will be spoiling big moments about the comic. If you haven't read the comic and don't want to be spoiled, as we said, time to hop off now. But there are some big things about the comic book that we need to talk about, really, I suppose, before we get into the show, right? The comic book was a 12-issue limited series by Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons, and Lein Wein. Alan Moore is kind of well known around the world for saying, right, I'm done with this. I'm walking away from it. So he issued his comic book series. It came out monthly and then was collected in the graphic novel I think all of us have a copy of. But he basically said, this is my story. It's out there now and I'm gone. Dave Gibbons is much more open. He's been involved in the production of this show, actually. He's much more open to talking about it, much more open to revisiting. I think actually Alan Moore retired this year as well. So he's done. He's gone. If you guys want to make a TV show or a movie out of his stuff, it's nothing to do with him is basically his attitude.
And it never has been.
Exactly. Yeah. It's nothing to do with you guys. I'm including Lein Wein as one of the people who created the series. If anybody knows the comic book, you know that the style of it is very different. It's like it's perfectly matched to comic books as a medium. And Lein Wein was one of the head editors for the book and has been given credit as a creator of the series because he pulled all this stuff together in the book as you read it. There's loads of stuff like, there'll be something like an advert will appear and you think it's just an ad like you'd skip in a monthly comic book. It's not an ad. You have to read it. It'll actually give you massive either backstory or something that's happened to a character that disappears from the book in a little advert page. That's cool.
Beyond that, it's just the way it was overall when they started slicing in different chapters of Hollis Mason's book or Rorschach's the actual psychiatric notes written about Rorschach being sliced in, and there's a little scribble along the side of one of the pages that make it look like it was just quickly scribbled, but it's again a key piece of information.
Yeah, absolutely.
That you have to turn the graphic novel to kind of even read, and you think it's just a little blue scribble. Most people didn't even bother, to take it on board.
Exactly.
It's one of these books that it was edited, written, and the artwork is. You can constantly go back and reread it. Like, I've read it, I'd say at this point, probably 4 or 5 times throughout my life.
Yeah, definitely.
Each time I read it, I come away with something different. Or I discover something small that I didn't, because the first time I read it, I was probably young.
Yeah.
And I didn't read the actual, I looked at the pictures and I read the text bubbles, but I never read the actual Hollis Mason's inserts or the actual text pieces.
I think when you're reading comics as a kid, we were all reading comics in the 80s and 90s. Maybe Chris, you might not have been reading them in the 80s. There might have been more funny books at that stage. But when you were reading them in the 90s and you're reading Marvel comics and DC comics, you would get to a page where it would be advertising something and you just skip it. So I think we were all reading our books at that time the same way. And you kind of go, well, if it's not the 9-panel structure that's standard in comic books, you skip it. You don't read it. That's for adults. That's for other people kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, let's not forget you had the comic within a comic as well with the Black Freighter.
Yes.
And I mean, I remember my first read of Watchmen, I actually can honestly say I probably, other than the main thread story around Dr. Manhattan, I just remember thinking, what is Black Freighter about? Okay, it's kind of an interesting bit, but I didn't fully understand its relevance. The same with Under the Hood, the same with a lot of other aspects of this. It really did require, as you say, Chris, that multiple reading. And that's what's so good about it. Even if you read it for the first time, you have to read it again to fully explore and get under the hood of this graphic novel. I think.
That is the name of the tell-all biography in the book.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Good call.
And just the fact that you have multiple time periods, multiple storylines, and these different multiple storytelling methods of the comic within the comic, the biography, the newspapers, the case notes and all that. So it really is, absolutely multi-layered. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the book House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski, an American novelist. I think this is the main book that he's done, but he has a case note thing. He has the text written in spirals. He has the text written upside down, and it's all this horror story. And it really does kind of, this as a comic book, The Watchmen feels as close to, The House of Leaves as a novel, where it is slightly disorientating.
Absolutely.
And it makes you have to go back again and again. And in that sense, this is fantastic for that.
House of Leaves is one of the most amazing novels I've ever read. It's so fascinating, Chris. I have to give you my copy of it, but you can only really read it in physical form. You can't read it, even on digital, you can't really read it properly if you don't have it in a physical form in your hands. And I think that's the same with Watchmen. I do have a copy of it digitally. I do have my physical copy of it as well. But it feels like, there's bits that, as you say, Chris, that you need to kind of zoom in close to that you can't really do the same way on digital. What do we think overall? So this book does have a massive pressure on it. Is it always constantly called the greatest comic book of all time? I think that's because of its use of the medium. I think that's why it always gets that. It isn't for everybody, I don't think. So it's not the greatest comic book in the world if you're a Spider-Man fan and all you ever read is Spider-Man, but it is a great comic book if you love the medium of comic books, I think.
Yeah, and I think objectively speaking, one of the classic things about this is that it made the New York Times bestseller list and is one of the only comic books, if not the only comic book to have done that.
Certainly at the time.
And I think that from a purely objective point of view, even if you do not like comic books or you don't read them, then you have to understand how this and where this took the medium of comic books.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think of all those kind of comic books, as you say previously, in terms of it was just a linear structure, and here it takes it very adult, it takes it very bloody, it explores very dark themes about humanity and this idea of superheroes in it, as well as all these other things. I mean, just the pure story. And so it made, I think objectively, it probably is one of the top comic books, but subjectively, it's not going to be for everyone.
Yeah.
Personally, it's a must read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't mean it's one of my favorite comic books of all time.
Yeah.
It's probably in the top 20.
Mm-hmm.
But it wouldn't, for me, it's a must read because it's like To Kill a Mockingbird or, The Wind in the Willows,
right.
Or it's those books that are timeless that you have to read to kind of really, that it's literally up there in literature kind of greatness.
Yeah. Yeah.
It did so many things that were unique for the time, for the genre, for the model of comic books. People at that time still did not think of comic books being able to be adult, to talk about themes of rape and politics and everything else under the sun. Like, they weren't considered, anyone who was reading comic books at the time knew comic books could touch on those subjects and could talk about greater themes.
Yeah.
It was unique for its day because the mass then learned that these are the things that the comic books can touch on.
Well, absolutely. It does feel like what Alan Moore's greatest strength was. He brought a depth of storytelling to the mass market and kind of led the new wave of comic books throughout the 80s. This was a British wave of comic books that came in. The other outstanding example for me, obviously, is Neil Gaiman's Sandman, and Dave McKean's Sandman. It's a beautiful book, but if you tell anybody to read it and they read the first couple of issues, they go, this is just a comic book. If you read the whole series, it's one of the greatest things you've ever read, I think. One of the greatest things that's ever been published. And very much the same with Watchmen. You can walk away from Watchmen at the end and go, oh, I didn't really like it. It's about superheroes, but not the superheroes I like. Or it's about the Cold War, but it's a different universe. Or it's about something that I'm not really that interested in. But I don't think anybody can deny the artistry that's involved in it. Yeah.
So the one thing I will say, and I've had a lot of people disagree with me on it.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I have always felt Watchmen, the comic book, in the final act, if we take it as the amount of, like, if we take it as a 3-act substructure, right?
Yeah.
It starts to unravel slightly. And Alan Moore has always been amazing for me. Like, I love his Swamp Thing run.
Oh, yes.
Like, that was again a redefining of a character. It was a horror take. For me, the Watchmen, the ending, I've never fully understood everything in it.
Okay.
Like, it's continued so quickly. So literally, on my first 3 reads, did not notice certain things.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until certain things have been pointed out to me going, oh no, but you know that part. And I'm like, what? No.
Yeah.
Because one massive reveal is done in a single panel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. So again, speaking from personal opinions, I still love this book. I think it's one of the greatest graphic novels created. Personally, just for me, I feel they knew where they wanted to go, but then they started running out of pages to get there and just went, done. Okay. There you go. Okay, we're like, in this one panel, we're just going to explain a massive thing. Okay, so that ticks that box. It was a slight rush towards the ending. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we talked about this, Chris, when we were home the last time, you know, this big reveal that loads of people talked about for years, which is the squid attacking New York. People talked about that everywhere for years. And I was saying to Chris that I've read this book since I was about 15. Honestly, someone lent it to me. I read the book then. I read it multiple times since then. And I genuinely didn't see that page where the squid attacks because I'm like, that doesn't make sense. And everybody's been talking about it for years. How do you end, you know, if you're going to make a movie out of this or a TV show out of this, how do you include the big squid attack? And I'm like, what squid attack? What are these people talking about? The ending of the book is that Veidt gets his plan. It pays out the right way. And then what happens to Rorschach? And then what happens to Dr. Manhattan going off to live on another planet? You know, all of that stuff is the end of the book to me. But I never noticed this big moment that people were talking about, which is terrible. It's just one of those things that didn't stick in my memory.
For me, it was Rorschach's journal. I didn't, I knew it was given somewhere. I didn't cop where it was. Like that it was going to be printed it was given to a journalist and given to a newspaper so that it could be printed. And the only way you know that is going to be, and some of the stuff that you've been reading has been part of Rorschach's journal being printed, it kind of loops back in on itself, is because it's a little note in the panel on top of a Rorschach's journal. So it's literally, you have to squeeze in and go, please print this. This is the truth of what's happened. So kind of thing. Again, I'm paraphrasing here. But again, it's all those, it's so much that you're just kind of like, again, speaking just personally, it's just like, it fell apart in that tiny, like, last 8 pages.
I think The Watchmen as a comic, it requires your attention.
Yes.
And because it's a difficult read and it's really, really complex. And if you approach it like you would approach your weekly or monthly issue that you get in comics, then you're not going to know what is going on at all. So, it's like you said before, it's, you know, it's one of the greats. It's like you have to give it the attention it deserves because it's so intricate and multi-layered. And I think that's why sometimes I agree. When I first came at this, probably even the second and third time I read it, I still was like going, yeah, but I don't get this. I don't know what's happening. It's like J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. I just don't understand that book, yet it's supposed to be one of the classic books. And I think that's the same for this, but it requires your attention. I think any great bit of, whether it's novelization or comic book or anything like that, or music or artwork, it requires you to be attentive to what's going on.
Yeah, and it requires you to give it a go. I think that's the important part, right? Because, everybody says it's the greatest book of all time. To them, if that's their rating of it, that's awesome. But if you don't at least give it a go, then you're never going to know, right? That's kind of the thing. So I'm perfectly happy if you say you didn't like this, it's not for you. That's absolutely cool. At least you gave it a go, right? So, also, just before we finish off the comic book section here, I do want to give a specific call out to Dave Gibbons, because I do feel this book is always talked about as being Alan Moore's book, and what Dave Gibbons did with the artwork in here is also fantastic. One that I just noticed recently, which I really like, is the smiley face symbol that you always see with the blood splatter along the side of it. Yeah. What I only noticed recently is the doomsday clock in the book that they always talk about being set at 5 minutes to midnight. The blood splatter that's on the smiley face is at exactly the position of 5 minutes to midnight as well. So the two of those images are interchangeable. It's the opening image of the book. We see it in the movie. And in the book, we regularly see the doomsday clock as well being set to 5 minutes to midnight. It's a tiny touch. Everybody else probably noticed it. I only noticed it in my last reading, this year. So brilliant props to Dave Gibbons for all of his work as the artist on this book, as well as all the writing that was involved from Alan Moore. Recently, we've heard from some comic book writers and artists who do specifically say comic books are written by two people. They're not like novels. They're always written by the writer and the artist, regardless of who they are. It's completely collaborative as a process. So that's what makes them special and different. They're not just storyboards for movies, right? They're their own media.
Yeah. And Gibbons did one of the first things to do was take a more human approach to comics, like where the actual the design of the actual heroes or the anti-heroes was more grounded in reality.
Yes.
So, for example, the comedian's face is scarred, and it stays scarred throughout the whole thing, and it's the same. It's in the same placement for the whole thing.
Yeah. And we only found that out, what happened to him and how he got the scar. You only find that out in like issue 5 or 6 of the book. It's really, really cool. And he's also based on Nick Fury, which I only found out quite recently as well. So yes, Nick Fury did make it into the Watchmen.
Good stuff.
Is that enough of the comic book, guys? Because we will hopefully be coming back to the comic book during the course of this season, and hopefully maybe after the season's ending, we're going to possibly talk about the comic books individually.
Yeah, I think we've talked quite nicely. I think that's the shortest amount of time you can probably talk about this graphic novel. I think it's time to talk about the movie directed by Zack Snyder.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it was a difficult task, right? This is one of the things, you talk about Lord of the Rings as a set of novels, and you go, that's unfilmable because it's set in an alternate universe with loads of creatures that don't exist right now. So when it came out in the 40s and 50s, nobody thought that you could actually create monsters and creatures like this with CGI, obviously. And you go, that's completely unfilmable. Watchmen came out in the 80s. And people went, it's unfilmable because of the format and the way this guy did it. I personally do think that this may have driven Zack Snyder slightly crazy. The movie was released multiple ways. I said it earlier on, you had the theatrical version, you had the director's cut, you had the ultimate cut, you had the animated Black Freighter movie, you had the Under the Hood documentary, which came as an extra on the DVD. They were all made by Zack Snyder. He made everything he possibly could out of the book, and then edited it all together multiple times. The ultimate cut is 3 hours and 25 minutes long, and the theatrical version that we all saw in the cinema is 2 hours 43. So you've got another 40 minutes of footage all edited back into the movie, basically, which Zack Snyder did over, I think it was like 4 or 5 years that he released the movie. I think it was 2009 he released that one, the original cut in the cinema, and then the final ultimate cut was done in like 2016. So 5 or 6 years of him working on this one project to try and bring it to life. And what I think is interesting about it is how little he did actually change from the unfilmable comic book. I think that's a great testament to Zack Snyder. I think it is his masterpiece after watching it. I think it is the true film that he should be using as his calling card, his final cut of that movie.
I'm in complete agreement with you. I've yet to watch, as of recording this, I've yet to watch the ultimate. I've watched directors, I've watched the theatrical, I've watched individual pieces, but I've yet to watch the intersplice edited ultimate, which I will have watched by the time we record the actual TV show. But the one thing I will say is, yeah, I'm in agreement with you too. He gets a lot of flack for this because he changed certain things, but those certain things make sense in a world where we have the theatrical releases of Batman, we have Nolan films, we have, in a world where we have 300, where Warner Brothers, Zack Snyder was picked by Warner Brothers for this film because of his work on 300. Because he brought these crazy scenes to life. So a lot of, like, he has a very particular style, but you gotta remember, it's not just one man. No one man makes a film. Like,
of course.
He has corporate bosses. Like, they will have said they wanted certain things in there. But to be fair, as a director, as a producer, he would have taken certain aspects and go, no, the reason I'm not going to include this part or this part or this part is because it doesn't make sense to the wider story at the end.
Okay. Yeah. And I think this is where I learned about in the making of this movie, this is where I learned about that scene that I completely blanked from my mind, that it ends with the squid attacking New York. Because they were like, well, he's not going to put that in the movie. And I'm going, what was that? I don't remember that. I know New York got attacked and I know loads of people got killed. I don't really remember the squid attack. So he did change that for the movie. And I think rightly so.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he has to take a choice on this. And I mean, for me, I really like this. I like the way that he captures certain moments from the comic. You know, I mean, like with the comedian being chucked through the window at the start.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and the fact that he slows it down so it almost becomes a still, which is then the comic panel of, the comedian straight out of the window after being thrown. So, you know, that to me is amazing. I think certain, things around, Dr. Manhattan as well. It just looks like it's coming straight from the comic book.
Yes, blue schlong. Yes.
Yeah, his blue schlong, as well as his glass crystal palace on, is it Mars or
Mars.
the moon? It is Mars, isn't it? Yeah. I think as well, you know, props to Zack Snyder for the casting, because I think Jeffrey Dean Morgan as the comedian, as Edward Blake, is phenomenal.
Stunning.
And I think Jackie Earle Haley as Rorschach, again, is great casting. I love his character. I love how he portrays Rorschach, in this. I think, you know, Matthew Good has that, particular angularity about him to be Adrian Veidt and Billy Crudup as Dr. Manhattan. I think they all work really nicely.
Do you know, this is a really weird thing to say, but Dr. Manhattan, played by Billy Crudup, is a really weird character because he's a completely blank slate and has to play as a blank slate for most of the film. He has to play not anger, has to play not annoyance with anybody. He has to just go, these are my decisions. This is how I'm living with it. If you want to get angry about that, that's your choice, kind of thing. And it's a really interesting blank character from Billy Crudup, who, you know, he did Almost Famous. He's one of my favorite characters in that movie. I love him in that, but I love how simply he plays Dr. Manhattan, because he just goes, I've weighed up all the opportunities and this is my decision. And he plays that point from the 1950s all the way through to the end of the movie in 1985. So I really do think he's one of the best casting choices. And it's such a it's seemingly simple role to play, but it must have been so difficult to restrain yourself from having any reaction.
Absolutely. And I think that there's another image that I think Zack Snyder gets, you know, the accident where he gets blasted with the radiation to move from being, the doctor looking at nuclear physics, can't remember his name, to Dr. Manhattan. That image where he's caught within the chamber, and is exposed to the radiation is just really good, because it just captures it so well.
The overall cinematography of the film, like, just in every aspect, is, as you guys have said, stunning. Like, it's just that. He used the comic book as his storyboard. So basically there's, remember the prison scene in the film? Where you have, Jupiter and you have Night Owl coming down the corridor, while they're having the conversation. And the panel it's two panels of them going through to get through prison to Rorschach. In the film, it's about 4 or 5 minute while they have the conversation, and they're like, he used that, but he just brought it a bit more to life. Now, it is violent, but it was one of the first R-rated films. Like, not R-rated films, sorry. It's one of the first comic book R-rated films.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the few R-rated comic movies. We have Deadpool now, obviously.
Yeah.
But certainly at the time.
Very
I mean, that's why I'm almost, I'm a big Doctor Strange fan. I really hope that the Multiverse of Madness, I would love it if they made it into an R-rated.
It won't be, but they will make it scary, is the point. Scary in a PG way.
Yeah, it's like the New Mutants. The New Mutants has gone from an R-rated film to a 13. PG-13. So that's...
If it ever gets a release.
That's exactly
correct,
it. Yeah. So the where I was going with that was, this is as faithful an adaptation as you can get of a comic book. And I think it's to him, as you said, like, the joke is that he may have gone mad doing this. But it was worth it, because the end is this perfect kind of adaptation.
Exactly. Yeah. It is a masterpiece. I think by the end of it, by the final version of this movie, I think it's a masterpiece in its own right. There are things that you would obviously try to change. If it's an unfilmable comic book, change things to make it a good movie. It was so interesting watching this when it came out in the theater, because I remember the reviews being almost split down the middle. I remember IGN, I think, gave it 10 out of 10, said it's a perfect film. And there were other massive outlets that gave it like 5 out of 10, kind of going, yeah, okay, have a look at it, but it's nothing new. He didn't take enough chances, I suppose, was kind of their attitude. But absolutely fascinating. One of the things that I think is really interesting, these days we always talk about Marvel having these movies that make $1 billion when they're released. And if they get less than $1 billion, they're a failure, right? That's what people seem to say all the time, right? If DC release a movie now and it's made for 100 million and makes 500 million, it's a failure. Like Justice League, for example, people call that a failure because it didn't make $1 billion. This movie by Zack Snyder, which has been, well respected for many years, let's put it that way, I suppose. It cost about 130 million to make and made just around the region of $185 million in the box office. That's still a profit. Yeah. It's still $55 million that existed in punters' pockets and eventually existed in the studio's hands, right? So that's a massive success, I think. But not judged against the massive successes the comic book movies are nowadays, right?
Yeah, but, not to really sidetrack this, but recently had the conversation about the fact that this is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
We should not judge movies by whether just their box office alone.
Absolutely.
That is what a company does.
Yep.
And that is why, yes, Marvel, Disney, even Warner Brothers, DC, they will judge that from their business side on the box office.
Mm-hmm.
But just because it makes a lot of money doesn't mean it's good. In the same way as if it makes a loss or doesn't make that much, then that doesn't mean it's bad.
Yep.
But the problem is that's the surrogate that's being used now as to determine the success. And it should be if you're a business, absolutely. But as an average punter watching it, it's about whether you liked it. We don't ask on a monthly basis. I wonder how much money issue number 4 of Marvel's, like, whatever, like Contagion at the moment, how much did that make?
Mm-hmm.
So why do we do it on movies? I don't really get it.
Yeah.
I'm becoming kind of fairly anti-box office, that is a surrogate for good or bad from an artistic point of view, because I don't think it is. But from a business point of view, absolutely.
Absolutely. Wasn't there even that scene in The Boys this year that we talked about where we had the big company Vought Industries, based on Vite, as we know, from the Watchmen comic books. We had that moment where they were standing up in front of all of their fans, almost giving their finance call to the fans who were cheering about how much money this organization is making out of them. You're like, hi, everybody in the audience, we just took billions of dollars from your pocket because we're presenting this future and these costumed heroes to you. So definitely something in the minds of people now watching this stuff. I think of the movie as a success. If you make more money than it costs to put it out there, it's not a failure, right? So I don't know what other way you can do it. One thing really quickly before we get out of the movie area, John, It is Dr. John Osterman was Dr. Manhattan. I had to look it up while you were talking. So Dr. John Osterman. It's just you only really hear Silk Spectre call him John throughout the book. So it does kind of get lost in there, and everybody else in the world seems to call him Dr. Manhattan from the accident onwards. But a brilliant scene. You were absolutely right to call that one out. Chris, anything else on the movie to talk about before we go?
It's going to see a revival with this TV show coming out.
Absolutely.
Everyone is going to watch it again. Because, strangely enough, even, any of the channels that's on streaming, anywhere you can buy it, is right now already prepping it, because I've seen it on offer at the moment. So it's everywhere. Slowly it will come to the surface over the next couple of weeks.
Oh, without a doubt, especially with this show being a show that you can't binge, I suppose. It's a TV show that has 9 episodes that are available once a week, every week. We'll talk about the TV show in a second, but, so that means people are going to they'll watch the first episode and go, oh, I need to go and watch that movie again and just see if there's anything from the movie that was picked up. One of the things I wanted to call out before we get into that, the actual physical copy I have, the graphic novel I have, I think I bought it back in the 2000s, of the Watchmen graphic novel. On the back of the book itself, from Lost co-creator Damon Lindelof, he calls this the greatest piece of popular fiction ever produced. So he's actually got the liner note on the back of the book that I have. So he has been so involved in this concept of this book really for, a couple of decades now, I suppose, right back to when he was on Lost, so he's always loved this as a book. So interesting that he's the one involved in the TV show. On the movie, Chris, I interrupted you. Any last things on the movie?
Just that the ending is different in the movie. So this is different from the comic book. So what we are going to see and we'll discuss it in a second about the TV show, is different. Yeah. It is not based on the film. It's based on the comic books and where we may have gone from based on the ending there. Let's jump into it. But John, anything from your side?
No, I mean, I think from my side, I just think both the comic and the movie in their own different ways, is really good. And I think, like with the TV show, and we're about to talk about that, it can only take inspiration from Watchmen. It's an adaptation, but it's an adaptation of something that hasn't ever been discussed. Alan Moore hasn't done sequels to The Watchmen, so this is new material with his work as inspiration, and there is some adaptation, I suppose, that will happen. But I think we have to view it as totally new. I think we're obviously going to compare it, but it's a comparison based on inspiration to create this TV show from Damon Lindelof.
Absolutely. And isn't it interesting? Once again, it is an adaptation into a movie from a comic book. And I think the seminal version of a comic book, or one of them anyway, is Watchmen. So adapting that into a completely different medium. It's totally visual and totally audio based in movies, whereas Watchmen obviously was a comic book and turned into a graphic novel. So this is a massively different endeavor. I think it was a success, and I'm really happy that we have it in the world to go back to, and I have watched it many times over the years. So I think he did a great job. I'm really intrigued to see what Damon Lindelof is going to give us in this TV show. I think we need to get into the TV show. Now, this episode is being released on the 16th of October or the 15th of October. The embargo for the episode discussions is that same day. We're not going to spoil the episodes here. We're going to talk about the episodes after their release. The first episode comes out, as I said, on the 20th of October. So we're going to go into full spoilers about that. Myself and John have watched the first episode. We're raring to talk about that when we get to our podcast episode, but make sure you subscribe to the podcast to hear our thoughts about the episodes. We're not going to be spoiling anything right now. What I can say is, yeah, you're going to like this one. But first off, I suppose, Damon Lindelof, we've talked about him a couple of times. I think everybody knows who he is, but not everybody does, right? We always say the one word we don't like talking about on the podcast is obviously. Those words are something that we don't like to say because everybody comes at things from a different way, right? So Damon Lindelof is one of the co-creators of Lost. He did start right at the beginning of Lost with J.J. Abrams behind him, with Carlton Cuse, both of them involved in the creation of the TV show, one of the most popular TV shows of the 2000s, really, lasted for many, many years. He's a bit maligned, I would say, as a creator. He creates these massive properties. I think he has this term for things, which is like he has this mystic box that he says, I will reveal what's in the mystic box. You want to know what's inside the mystic box, don't you? And he does that for every episode of his shows. He does it for every movie that he's been in. He has this mystic box. And he feels that his shows and movies aren't about revealing what's inside the mystic box, but he tells the audience that's what you should be interested in. And the audience are maybe sometimes a bit disappointed when they see inside the mystic box, because he didn't know what was inside it to begin with, is kind of the way that it happens.
Because it was all a dream, wasn't it? They were in purgatory.
They were not in purgatory. They all died, and this was after the fact they ended in purgatory. Everybody came back together in purgatory whenever they died over the next 20 or 30 years.
And what was the polar bear about?
The polar bear was actually released from an experiment on the other island, and it came to the island.
And was the black smoke the devil?
The black smoke was a representation of evil, yeah, and then we had white. We had the opposite side of the black and white. Is very, very central.
So was the island purgatory?
No, the island was never purgatory. The island was just the island. Interesting.
Damn it, I totally misunderstood.
It blocked the evil from being released to the planet. Anyway, that's just one of his shows. One of his other shows, I watched it this year because I'd heard about it for years and never got access to it, unfortunately, until this year. The Leftovers, also a HBO show.
It's a cooking show, isn't it?
It is not, unfortunately. It is an awesome show. The opening scene of this show is basically a woman with her baby crying in the back of the car, and then suddenly the baby stops crying and the baby's disappeared, and they realize that across the planet Earth, about 3% of the entire population is just snapped out of existence. And then it cuts to 3 years later and how these people are dealing with that moment, because it's not about what happened to those people. It's about what happened to the people left behind. It's so good.
But it was basically people being brought to heaven.
Well, importantly, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, throughout the series of Watchmen on HBO, importantly, that may be your takeaway. Is it mine?
See, this is why Damon is for me, is sometimes so esoteric. I'm just like, yeah, but everyone has a different view, and I'm like, no, I just want to know. Give me the direct. Is it black? Is it white? Is it a yes? Is it a no? It could be a yes. It could be a no. What do you think? And I'm like, no, because that's just that's going to breathe discussion, which is always great.
Yeah.
But it will also breed argument, which is not so great.
Well, it depends on whether you have a podcast to talk about them on or not.
The podcast is just amazing. But the amount of heated discussions I've had regarding the ending of Lost, and everyone's just like, but no, and I'm like, but yes, but maybe. So I think you're right. What we're going to see throughout the show, every episode, we will all come away with different views, different opinions, different thoughts and takeaways from each of the different things that happen, because they're going to be very esoteric.
Maybe not every episode, Chris. Sorry, I was trying to think of an alternate way of saying that.
See, you both keep saying takeaway, and I keep thinking leftovers. So,
excellent.
And I think, just as an aside as well, it's really where podcasting came into its own with Lost.
Without a doubt.
Because it drove this discussion, this speculation, the intrigue about why the hell do we have a polar bear on effectively a tropical island?
What's that hatch about?
What is that smoke?
Yeah.
And everything to do with that. And that is what makes it amazing. But having said that, yes, the discussions about Lost, is just crazy.
Yeah. I remember those websites. I remember those theory websites that used to pop up. There used to be multiple blogs, and then a load of people picked up microphones, talked into them, talked to each other about their theories about Lost. I think the biggest example is Jay and Jack, who are still going to this day, about 15, 16 years after they started podcasting. Great TV podcasters specifically, always digging into really good shows. But we haven't had a really, really good one that's kind of captured everybody for quite a while. Probably because of this kind of partition that we see over time, all these shows that are just dropped on Netflix and don't have any discussion, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, maybe Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones would be a massive.
Walking Dead.
Yeah, Walking Dead's great. Obviously, loads and loads of podcasts about that. I've been on a few myself. So, that's very, very cool stuff. Actually, I've been on a Game of Thrones and a Walking Dead podcast over the year. Let's talk about what we do know, I suppose, from Damon Lindelof. Chris, you say he's sometimes a bit esoteric, so we don't know exactly what's going on. We know for definite, which is really cool, that this is based off the 12-issue comic series, The Watchmen. Not a follow-up to the movie, even though the look might look similar in trailers or adverts. It's not specifically a follow-up to the movie. It is based on the 12-issue comic series, which means we may see reference to the things that were changed from the comic book series.
Yep. So we basically may hear of a giant squid attacking New York.
We may.
An interdimensional squid attacking New York. We may.
There you go.
The other thing we do know, it is set 34 years after the events of the comic book, which ended in 1985.
Can we do the mathematics quick, Chris?
Okay. So it is set now.
There you go. It is set this year. Yeah, set 2019. It's a contemporary piece, but based on the world in the comic books, based on things that happened within that novel and how they affected the world. And 34 years later, right? So that's kind of cool. So there's going to be things that will happen in the show where you'll go, Richard Nixon was president for far longer in this world than he was in the real world, because in the comic books he lasted a lot longer, you know?
Absolutely. And I think it's what are the topics as well. You know, with the original comic series, it was set around that idea of nuclear destruction. Yes, it ends up with a giant squid attacking New York. And maybe that's just a word on effectively, you might be focusing on this, but this other thing comes and destroys you. Mm-hmm. And it's what is the thing that is setting that clock to, 5 minutes to midnight or 2 minutes to midnight? Yeah. So it'll be interesting just to see what is the driver around the impending doom to some extent, or what is the thing that causes the trouble and strife within the world at the moment? What is causing that tension, that division, that nervousness?
Yeah.
And maybe it is something that, whilst ever present, we should be focusing on something completely else, because that might be the thing that comes to squid us in the ass, so to speak.
That's a really strange phrase, John. I don't think anybody's ever said that.
The one thing I will say, based on previous TV works, based on the comic book, this will be a thing. This will be a show for eagle-eye viewers. So in the comic book, Rorschach was always in the background, which we don't learn until slightly later, that he was around. There was always little things and clues in the background of the scene, on the panel. In Lost, little things that were said or done or shown very early at the show, at 3 seasons later, came back to be revealed as a really big thing. So I am fully expecting, when we get to the final episodes of this season, to have something revealed or something shown, and you're like, what do you mean? And then going back and looking at episode 1 and going, oh my God. And in episode 4, it was here. And then over there, it was, and over there, like, it's going to be, we will all be Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, with like strings attached to the wall, just kind of going left and right, because it will generate that kind of, it will be built that way.
Absolutely. And we hope as a podcast, we'll navigate that with our wonderful audience, who will obviously see things that we won't see, and will hopefully see things that you guys, our watchers as well, may not see, and we'll talk about them on the podcast.
Definitely. And I think we should have a bet now as to what are the odds that it will just be a giant squid that comes to destroy the planet again.
Or what are the odds that everybody's in purgatory already? Yeah.
Oh, God.
You never know. You never know.
Absolutely.
One of the other massive things, and that we do know, and for me, this is fantastic. The soundtrack and the score for the show is being done by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. You guys may know these two. Trent Reznor, the lead singer and writer, effectively, of everything Nine Inch Nails have ever done, one of my favorite bands. The scores that he has done over the years since he moved into scoring, I think he's won a couple of Oscars, or at least been nominated every time that he's produced his scores. He did the original soundtrack for David Fincher's Social Network, which really upped the intensity of what should be a standard biopic. He also did probably a really massive film, David Fincher's Girl with Dragon Tattoo, massive movie, and Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross worked on the soundtrack for that as well, giving that really taut feeling to, again, a pretty straightforward kind of film. So just absolutely brilliant choices for the show. Definitely not a spoiler here, I don't think. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, their music that they've created for this pilot will keep you unsettled at moments throughout the pilot. Their actual final ending theme tune for the show is different and really good. I must say, really enjoying and looking forward to hearing that every week. Let's talk about just other things that we do know. Jeremy Irons is playing who we all think he's playing was on the poster at San Diego Comic-Con for Jeremy Irons. Absolutely brilliant marketing there, right?
So, yes, but I also think this is look at our left hand. Actually, it's going to be our right hand. Like, it's going to be an old switcheroo. I think.
You think?
I'm hoping that they, like, okay, so the spoiler is Ozymandias. He is playing.
Yes.
Ozymandias as an old man. That's a bit on the nose. So okay. I'm hoping it's something different, but.
So Ozymandias, also known as Adrian Veidt, the head of the organization, the person that effectively created the situation at the end of the Watchmen comic book and the movie, he's the one responsible for everything that happened to the world, I suppose. So you're saying he's not still alive? You're saying this isn't Jeremy Irons?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm okay with it. It's just, the marketing is very on the nose. Like, very. They have not told us who the Silk Spectre will be. They have not told us, who, Owlman is, as the cast. They will be in there. Because they are alive. So, like, there's some actors on both sides who could play both of these characters. But they're not telling us that. They're not giving us a name. They're not telling us the actors, the character's name for these other actors and actresses.
I loved at New York Comic Con when they were posed with these questions, or they were asked these questions, you know, are you playing Ozymandias? Are you playing Adrian Veidt to Jeremy Irons? And he says, we're not saying that at the moment. What we're saying is, I'm playing who you think I'm playing. Exactly. And Damon Lindelof as well, same thing. He was asked and he goes, well, look at the poster. It says he's playing who you think he's playing. So, I love that. It's like, if some people could be going, is he playing God? Yes, he is. Is he playing his character from other movies that he's been in? You know, I think he played, Alfred Pennyworth, the butler in the past. So is he playing Alfred Pennyworth? Yes, he is. That's who you think he's playing.
Well, absolutely. I mean, for me, I personally think he's playing Adrian Veidt for sure.
Right. Interesting.
So it's very much a wait and see. I think they're having either fun with this or it's a old switcheroo.
Excellent. Well, the cast of the show is really good. You know, we just talked about Jeremy Irons right there. He's one of those seminal actors that appears in so many things, and he's brilliant in almost everything. Yes, Jeremy's Iron. If anybody's a Simpsons fan, that is how you do an anagram of Jeremy Irons. But yes, also Oscar winner Regina King, who starred in season 2 of The Leftovers, done by Damon Lindelof, also in the show. So really good to see what she's going to do. She is the lead actress. She's the lead character in the show. And Lindelof said he really wanted to work with her again and really wanted her involved in the Watchmen. Let's talk about a couple of little quotes that came out of the last couple of weeks, just in this section, because the TV shows we're going to be covering for 9 more weeks. Let's talk about some of the things we do know going into the show, right? So let's talk about some of the interesting quotes that we've heard from Lindelof, I suppose, about the show so far. Over in his interview at Build in NYC, Lindelof talked about the inspiration for the show's setting and why it's set in where it is. It's set in Tulsa, Oklahoma, not in New York, not in Washington, not anywhere like that. It's set in Oklahoma, and it was inspired by an article called The Case for Reparations, which was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates for Atlantic magazine back in 2004. In the article, Coates talks about a race riot in 1920s Tulsa that Lindelof said he'd never heard anything about at all. He was fascinated that something like this could happen, where businesses that were owned by black people in the 20s in the US were destroyed and burnt out, and the people and owners were killed and hung in an attempt to destroy this ability of black Americans to get themselves out of slavery, which had happened in the previous century. It was an attempt to kind of take them down and take away everything they had. So his whole concept of setting this in Tulsa came from this article. You may recognize the name Ta-Nehisi Coates. He is the current writer for Captain America comic books at the moment, and Black Panther. So really interesting that it's another comic book writer who's giving inspiration to this show.
Yeah, I think it's that's really interesting, because I know from kind of the teasers that we've seen of it at the moment, you know, the Rorschach kind of masks, you know, they give off a certain vibe that this is really almost like the Ku Klux Klan in that sense. I think you have this highly sort of elevated aspect around racism effectively in America, and I do think this is kind of really important, setting what is the big danger. And maybe this is the red herring, that yes, it is happening, but be wary, because something can come from left field. But Yeah, this is really interesting. I think even already just with this kind of conversation, hearing about this, the case for reparations, it just makes it really interesting and deep, and probably it's slightly unsettling.
Definitely. You know, it's like that idea of taking Dr. Manhattan and dropping him in the middle of the Vietnam War. What would happen if you had a 600-foot tall super being walking into Vietnam? Well, they win the war, right? There's no doubt about it. That's what happened in the comic book. So Lindelof is taking this idea and going, well, if we were in a world in the 20s where there was this race riot that went on, and then a couple of years later, all of these superheroes came out of the woodwork. How does the world change? How does the world repair itself? How does the world fix itself around this new state? So I just think it's a really interesting quote from him.
Yeah, exactly. I think he says in it that he used it to kind of come up with the idea. So I think based on what he does, he takes the idea and then builds and builds and builds and builds. I think the theme of race and war and reparations and everything, and being in a very self-contained area like Tulsa will be the initial thread there, but I think it will be very built upon. So that you can still see the initial idea. It would just be one of many.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think another really interesting thing coming out of an interview with EW that Damon Lindelof did was that, you know, the show is going to avoid moralizing, even though there are probably going to be some really significant areas where that could be, for a lot of shows, a default value. So in the interview with EW, the interviewer said, I think perhaps your boldest move I've heard about so far is Regina said about in an interview we did that you're not only diving into very hot button topics, but you're handling them in such a way that viewers can read whatever they want into their meaning. You're avoiding moralizing at a time when popular entertainment is terrified of being misunderstood, because there's such a willingness online to accuse artists of bad intentions. Is that an accurate read? And does that kind of freak you out? In reply, Lindelof goes, the read is completely accurate, and yeah, it freaks me out. But when I'm freaked out is when I get excited. I can't write or create from a nervous, scared space. If you stop and try to talk yourself out of doing something that might be upsetting or might make people onerous or confused or uncomfortable, you're never going to do anything interesting. You have to jump in with some degree of forethought and responsibility, and then afterwards you can ask yourself why you did it. The time for contemplation is not at the edge of the diving board, because going back down the ladder is worse than the distance to the pool. I also kind of feel like, unfortunately, we live in a space where hate runs rampant, not just on the internet, but in real life. And it's important to remind ourselves this is a TV show. It is not real, although it is dealing with real issues, and it's meant to generate and provoke conversations and emotions. We have to contextualize that this is fiction.
That is like catnip to a podcaster, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We're going to have episodes that are going to go 4 or 5 hours talking about things in this show.
I think it's true. It is fiction. Yeah. There are going to be things that are disturbing and uncomfortable for people, but you cannot live in a perfect world in that sense. It's not to say you shouldn't strive for it, but this is going to be unsettling. I think that's what I meant by unsettling. Everything I've seen is unsettling. It throws light onto things about race, probably just about common decency, on violence that, you know, we will see in these episodes. And I like this idea that you cannot write a TV show, a book, a comic, whatever, trying to think about negotiating or navigating your way so that there is no criticism or dare I say it, incensed rage. And I think where there is incensed rage, yes, it needs to be contextualized. Yeah. It is a TV show. Get over yourself.
Well, yeah, I like what the person in AW has pointed out here, that loads of shows do that. Popular entertainment does that constantly. It just avoids having those discussions and presenting a piece of pop culture. And that's absolutely fine. You know, I'm perfectly happy with some people doing that, but we also need to be challenged occasionally as well. You know, I'm intrigued to see whether this is going to be massively incendiary and suddenly we're going to have, you know, stop that TV show from being made, stop broadcasting it. Will we have that kind of visceral reaction from people that are not used to being challenged by their TV anymore? I'm really intrigued, and I love that Damon Lindelof has taken this idea out and seeing how he'll play with it, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Just quickly from my side, it is, I think, you know, Russell T Davies with his Years and Years,
yes,
is another one where it was an alternate future. It was controversial. It talked about things. It had hot button issues, I suppose, like immigration and how people relate to that. And again, a TV show explores difficult areas, and you get this incendiary, oh, it's just liberal elite kind of thing. Yeah. But at the same time, it's a TV show. And at the end of the day, it's just crazy what's going on. I think this will be interesting. I suspect this will make a lot of people sad and unhappy.
Well, let's see. Chris?
For me personally, I think it's, as you said, this is catnip for podcasters.
This feels exciting, doesn't it?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I know I'm personally probably going to have some views where I'm like, I'm just going to say them. And the thing I just want all our audience to know is we want to hear your views too. You may not agree with our views. You may not agree with our take on it. So tell us your take. Like, that's what our community is for on Facebook. That is what our feedback forums are for. So we can take and listen to your view. We may not agree with it. You may not agree with ours. And that is what Damon is saying. You will have views. Everyone will have their own personal, opinion or take on it. Not everyone is right, but everyone can have that.
And I think what I love about Lindelof is he does set his shows up for you to have possibly contrary opinions to his own even, which I think is fascinating. One final quote that he was talking about at NYCC, he was talking to Deadline.com about the production of the show effectively. Deadline asked him, if a renewal was given for the show, how many seasons is your Watchmen? Lindelof says, I'm not being flippant when I say that the answer is 1. Does that mean that there isn't going to be any more Watchmen? Not necessarily. Does that mean that I will be working on subsequent seasons of Watchmen? I don't know is the answer to that question. We designed these 9 episodes to be as self-contained as the original 12 issues. We wanted to feel that there was a sense of completeness to resolve the essential mystery at hand. Obviously, there is a potential promise for the further exploration of the world, but like the seasons of Leftovers that I did, as opposed to Lost, which was designed to have cliffhanger finales and a promise of future storytelling. There you go, straight from Damon Lindelof. We may get further seasons, but he's designed this show to have 1 season and 1 season only and have a complete story at the end. So this does give one other bit of hope as a podcaster. Like in a movie where you walk in and you see the opening credits and then you see the closing credits at the end, you'll probably get a resolution to all the things you're worried about in episode 2 of the show, where you're going, will I ever get an answer to that? Lindelof is saying, for the most part, you'll get an answer to the things that he's set up at the start and is going to go to the end.
So I take that as for the most part. For the most part.
Right.
I get a sense this will be, if they do decide it, if it does what they want and they get a second season order, it will be like American Horror Story. It will have, it will be set in the same universe. It will be somewhere else with different characters, but kind of relate back, similar to the comic book. He's going to be relating to the comic book. It's set in the same universe. It will mention some characters we know and heard about. It's just going to be a self-contained story. But I am pretty sure there'll be little things kind of carried over or not fully revealed to give him that, oh, hey, I have to come back and do 1 more season. Not because I need a couple more million dollars into my bank account, but because we owe the audience an explanation about this.
And just in reference to his comment about The Leftovers, that show did go on 3 seasons, even though the first season was self-contained and the second season was different and the third season was different. But I do love the idea of Watchmen 2019 in Washington, D.C. or in Chicago or in somewhere else in the country as a completely separate second season. I think this is a really cool time in TV where they're able to do that kind of stuff. That's kind of it on the quotes that I have from Damon Lindelof and about the TV show. Really excited to talk about the TV show overall.
Yeah, I think we should talk a little bit about our podcasts now. I suppose as we wind down, because we are going to be bringing a brand new structure for the Watchmen podcast, we've realized maybe we're overthinking this, like you can overthink the Watchmen comic book, and it might take a little bit of explaining, but in the real world, the Doomsday Clock signifies how close the human race is to a man-made global catastrophe. Mm-hmm. And since its inception, it's been reviewed and changed about 24 times, since its first launch in 1947. Yeah. And this is by the members of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Mm-hmm. And actually, as of January 2019, this year, the clock was set at 2 minutes to midnight.
Yes, the closest the clock has ever been to midnight since 1947 is as it is set.
Well, probably since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It didn't get past 2 minutes to midnight, but then either. What they're saying now is with climate change and with the human effect that has created the situation that we are now, we will have a global catastrophe, or it's more likely now that we will have a global man-made catastrophe now than it has been ever in the history, or has been before. So yeah, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a massive point, but we're at another one now, which is really interesting. And this is the time for Watchmen to kind of pin itself on that.
So that's the context, is the Doomsday Clock. Okay. And so we are going to be choosing our top 3 moments of each episode of The Watchmen. And in our countdown, to 2 minutes to midnight, our biggest point will come at 5 minutes to midnight. Our middle moment is going to come at 4 minutes to midnight, and our final discussion item will be at 3 minutes to midnight. And we'll end our chat at 2 minutes to midnight, because that's where we are at the moment. Mm-hmm. And that will be our moments of this show that we'll discuss. And I also think that our feedback section should be the Bulletin of the Atomic Watchman or something that. Yeah. Because, yeah. That sounds nice.
I like
Bulletin.
Yeah.
I like it. But that's the way we're going to run the podcast here. It's going to be based around the clock. It's going to be based around how close we are to midnight.
Absolutely. Chris?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting. I do like ending in a very scientific method. It makes sense then, our kind of boys moments, our 7 moment. We're creative with that, and we're going scientific with this. One other big change coming up is we will be releasing a second episode each episode we cover, where we'll be filled with your thoughts, your reactions, your feedback on the episodes. So please, because we hope that episode will actually be quite meaty and be good to talk through, we need your thoughts. We need your opinions. So you can send them in at feedback@tvpodcastindustry.com, or you can actually come over and just give us your feedback on the Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/tvpodcastindustries.
Yeah, as usual, I'll put up spoiler posts for the episodes just as they're coming out that day. So you can go into the spoiler post, watch the episode, tell us your thoughts after you've watched the episode, and we'll share them on that individual podcast. It'll hopefully be around 30 minutes. And then we'll be able to discuss them before the next episode comes out. I'm not going to give a specific date that we'll release the episode, but we'd love if you could get your feedback into us by Wednesday, 2 minutes to midday GMT, which is 1 p.m. In Central Europe, 7 a.m. Wednesday for US East Coast, and 4 a.m. Wednesday for US West Coast, 10 p.m. Wednesday for Melbourne. That's kind of about all I can calculate, guys. Sorry, that's all I've written down anyway.
Absolutely. And of course, just remember, you can also leave a voicemail over on our website at tvpodcastindustries.com. You can leave a clip of yourself up to 90 seconds of your thoughts or comments about the week's episode. So yes, please also make use of the voicemail. It's the tab on the right-hand side of the website.
That's right.
Click in.
Or you can just record yourself on your phone. There's loads of voice recording apps. Record yourself on your phone and email us to feedback@tvpodcastindustries.com. We'd love to hear your voice on the podcast. That's always really cool to have someone coming in and joining us with your voice for the thoughts on the episode and your feedback on the episode.
And again, people, fellow audience members, please remember that this show will be designed to give differing opinions, so everyone will have most likely similar or differing opinions. So keep it nice, keep it jovial. If you are going to discuss a point you don't agree with, be fair, be respectful of the other people having those opinions. Keep it PG-13, R-rated is fine, but just need to kind of keep it somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Unfortunately, if there are any curse words, I will have to edit them out like I normally do in a podcast. But that's my responsibility as the host and producer of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us for our thoughts about the Watchmen Prelude, the start of the Watchmen. We hope you stay subscribed to the podcast. If you enjoy what you hear, if you enjoy what we're talking about in the podcast, we'd love if you just share the podcast with your friends. We don't want you to do anything of that kind of go out and Apple Podcasts and review it or any of that kind of stuff. Just share it. Share the podcast, because sharing the podcast is sharing the love for what we do, right? And it's free for you as well. So we're not asking for money, just share the podcast. We'd love to get a big audience for this really interesting show coming up.
And just quickly before we go, a spoiler-free word of your thoughts of the first episode of Watchmen. Derek.
I'm going to have to use two words. Not disappointing. Chris, do you have a word to describe the first episode?
Watchful.
Nice. John, do you have a word?
Tense.
Oh, yes. Oh, tense is pretty good. Yeah,
tense.
Are we talking past tense, future tense?
No, just tense. It is one of those things that happens to me sometimes where in every scene I feel as though something bad is going to happen and it's going to scare the living daylights out of me. Yeah. So that is why I say tense, because no one feels safe.
Excellent.
And we'll be back for episode 1 of our Watchman Watch Along on Monday, the 21st of October, with episode It's Summer and We're Running Out of Ice. John, do you want to give us the official synopsis for this episode and tell us what they're going to give us?
Sure. Detective Angela Aber investigates the attempted murder of a fellow officer under the guidance of her friend and chief, Judge Crawford. The lord of a country estate receives an anniversary gift from his loyal servants.
Interesting. Loads of characters that we don't know doing things that we don't know anything about at all.
Exactly.
Angela Aber, we do know, is being played by Regina King, and we know that her friend, Captain, is being played by Don Johnson of Miami Vice fame. So really intrigued to see what he's going to be doing in this show. Yeah, interesting. Looking forward to that. Bye-bye, watchers. Keep watching The Watchmen.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, watchers. Can't wait to speak with you again soon.
Yes, and from all of us watching The Watchmen, we hope you watch The Watchmen with us. I'm trying to think of how many other W words I can come up with, but that's about it. So
while we're watching
The Watchmen, we want you to watch us watch The Watchmen.
There you go.
Why?
Because we're watching The Watchmen together.
There we go.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.